True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
On the morning of June 10th, 2008, a robbery was staged in the Colorado home of businessman Alan Helmick. Now, his wife Miriam came home to find Alan on the floor in a pool of his own blood. Because Alan had been shot in the back of his head, investigators believed that he had been taken by surprise, and this was an execution. But who was Alan's killer, and what was the motive? Join us at the quiet end for In the Cold Light of Day. After 2 years of marriage, Miriam and Alan were known to be a really happy couple. Miriam had some financial issues in her past, but she and Alan had worked out an arrangement where his property was to be kept in his name, and Miriam was just given spending money as she needed it. It wasn't until after his death, when it came out, that Alan had his own financial issues, and that there had likely been previous attempts on his life as well. So let's talk about this. What do we have for a beer?
We have a Denver beer. It's called Malice in Darkness, brewed by Fiction Beer Company. It's a Russian Imperial Stout, 10.6% alcohol by volume. So it's a handful.
Okay.
The beer's black in color. It's got a nice sized head, but it dissipates pretty quickly. Aroma of whiskey, chocolate, and a little bit of coffee. Now, taste is where this beer really shines. There's dark chocolate throughout, some coffee, and this has a strong whiskey background. A big-bodied stout, meant to be shared.
All right, sounds good. Let's open the beer.
Okay. We need to share it, though, because it's a big boy.
All right. Well, we're recording later than normal, so come on down to the quiet end and cozy up. And let's have a conversation about this murder of Alan Helmick.
A fascinating case.
Yeah. All right, Dickie, why don't you get us started here on this story?
Okay. So, talking about the deceased first, Alan Helmick grew up in Delta, Colorado. He was an athletic child and teen, with baseball being his best sport. He ended up marrying his high school girlfriend, Sharon, and he and Sharon had 4 children, 3 girls and 1 boy. Alan found that he was pretty good at business. He started his own real estate brokerage business, and this was quite successful. Then he branched out and began making money on other business and real estate investments. Together, he and Sharon gave their children a secure, loving home.
Yeah, they really seemed to. But after 30 happy years together, Sharon died suddenly. She had a heart attack on New Year's Eve 2003. And afterwards, by all accounts, Alan was totally lost without Sharon. And he fell into a really deep depression. Now, he'd known Sharon since he was 14 years old, and he really just had no idea how to live life without her. So by 2005, 2 years later, Alan was working through his grief and depression, doing his best, mostly for his kids' sake. He decided to take some ballroom dance lessons. That's something that Sharon had always wanted to do with him. And it was while he was taking these dance lessons in Grand Junction that he met his second wife, Miriam Giles. And he would rue the day.
He would come to, wouldn't he?
Yes.
So, and Miriam, she's the instructor at the dance studio, she had endured serious losses in her past.
Yeah, she wasn't really the owner, but she did manage it.
Okay.
And she danced very well.
Miriam had endured serious losses in her past, which Alan felt he could relate to after the sudden loss of his first wife. Miriam's first husband, Jack, had died of suicide after their 23-year-old daughter, Amy, had died of a prescription drug overdose. Now, Jack had been lying in bed beside Miriam when he shot himself. So this event, I can't even imagine lying there in bed with your loved one, and boom, gun goes off. Wow.
That could be very traumatic.
Must have been.
Well, Miriam had this rule that she didn't date her dance students, but Alan grew on her over time, and he was very obvious about how attracted he was to her. So she did agree to go out with him, and their romance became very serious very fast. Alan wanted to take care of Miriam, and she wanted someone to take care of her, so it kind of worked. And like you said, Alan really admired Miriam's strength, and he liked that she, too, had suffered from some grief and adversity in her life.
And so Miriam first moved in with Alan in his house in Delta, Colorado. And this was the home where Alan and Sharon had spent many happy years with their children. In an effort to escape the past and have a fresh start with Alan, Miriam began looking at other properties. She loved horses, and Alan agreed that he would buy her horses and a property where they could keep them. So they were looking around for a home with enough land, and Miriam settled on a place in Whitewater. New homes there were on lots with 40 or more acres, so a pretty good location to have horses. And Whitewater was also conveniently located between Delta and Grand Junction. Alan still did business in Delta, while Miriam had begun managing her own dance studio in Grand Junction. So Whitewater seemed to be a good compromise for the new home.
Yeah, they got married in 2006, and many of Alan's friends were there, but nobody from Miriam's past, so there's a little red flag.
Well, I guess.
Alan loved Miriam so much that he bought the dance studio in Grand Junction for her, and he also did all he could to help her out there, even though this business really was not expected to make a profit. You know, his accountant told him this was just a loser investment, so it was just something he did for Miriam.
Yeah.
He even helped her organize this dance competition for the grand opening of Dance Junction, and he'd become a really good dancer, so they put on quite a show for the people to bring in students. But after their wedding, Alan and Miriam seemed to be really happy, and most people thought they were very much in love. They always seemed to be together and looking out for one another. Alan's daughters were kind of concerned about how fast this relationship had moved forward, but they made efforts to have a good relationship with Miriam because they did want their dad to be happy after all. She seemed nice enough, and she did seem to really adore their father, at least in the beginning. She had even welcomed the husband of Alan's daughter, Portia, to stay in a spare room when he was on call closer to Whitewater, so that seemed kind.
Yeah, that was a very nice arrangement they had.
Yes.
Now, on April 30th, 2008, so what are we, a couple years into this marriage?
Yes.
Miriam was sick to her stomach. She was with Alan as he signed papers at a title company. At every few minutes, Miriam had to run off to use the restroom. And when she came outside to their car in the parking lot, Alan was sitting inside his Buick waiting for her. Miriam asked him to pop the trunk so that she could grab a pair of sandals she kept in there. But before she even had a chance to get her sandals, Miriam felt sick again and ran back to the restroom. So Alan's sitting there waiting patiently for Miriam to return, and he notices suddenly white smoke coming from the rear of his car. Now, at first he thought it was just exhaust fumes because the car was running. So he turned off the engine. But the smoke plume grew and started turning black. He got out of the car and saw now there were flames. His car had been set on fire.
Yeah, this is quite an event, really. So Alan had run into the building looking for a fire extinguisher, and as he searched, he saw Miriam coming out of the restroom. He told her what was happening, and she managed to find a pitcher of water in the building, which she was able to refill, and so she went in and out of the building trying to put out the fire. Alan called 911, and once the fire was out, he noticed there was like a wick, like a rag, where the gas cap should have been. So Alan pulled the wick out of the gas tank before the police and the fire department got there. But after the police arrived, they asked Alan why Miriam would want to get into the trunk of the vehicle. And Alan said, well, Miriam always kept different shoes in there. She'd been wearing tennis shoes with no socks that day, so he assumed those were uncomfortable, and she asked him to pop the trunk. But when Miriam was asked if she had changed her shoes, she said no, and Alan did agree with that. Alan had believed that this was because Miriam got sick again, and she ran back in to use the restroom. But, it's very suspicious because Miriam had been the only one near the back of the car. And Alan would have been able to see if anyone else had sneaked up to set a fire. It's right there in the back of his car. When one of the police officers commented to Alan that it seemed that Miriam had been the one to start the fire, they couldn't see any other way this had happened. Alan said, oh no, that can't be. But, he did think about it, and then he did say to the policeman, of course you could never be 100% sure about anybody. So we don't know what was going on those first 2 years.
Yeah, but it makes you wonder a little.
But this event definitely makes you wonder.
Yeah.
And the police, just following the facts, really can't see any other reason why this would have happened.
Right.
Any other way that it could have happened.
It seems that maybe this loving relationship wasn't maybe so loving after all.
Might have been a little one-sided. But, there's a lot behind Miriam that we'll get to. But just remember this event because this was really kind of weird. So He's saying he's not really sure of her, but he wants to be, pretty much, is how I take it. So...
Yeah, I mean, his first answer is, no, I can't be. She wouldn't do that.
Right.
But then he kind of considers a little bit and says, can't be 100% sure.
Well, and that makes me think there must have been other little things in those first 2 years of marriage that gave him pause.
Some other events had happened that made him wonder about her.
Exactly. Because if he'd never had any doubts about her, I don't think he would have said that.
Yeah, and then the police were even more suspicious of Miriam because the bathroom in the office building smelled of lighter fluid. Well, how about that? Miriam said that Alan had given her the wick to throw away, which she had done in the bathroom trash. She claimed that Alan had come into the restroom later and wanted the wick back. But then Alan said, well, I'm not sure I remember things exactly that way. He had been too focused on putting out the fire. And he said, I don't remember her taking it in there. I don't remember going in and asking for it, but I very well may have.
So that's kind of weird. I wonder what was going on there with Alan. Because he said that Miriam had a good memory and that he doesn't always remember events moment to moment as well as she does. So he's pretty much saying her memory's better than his, even though it seems like somewhere inside of him he doesn't believe that. How could you? So I'm really not sure of his thought process, but there's something going on in that marriage, wouldn't you agree?
It certainly seems that way.
Yeah. So after that car fire, life for Miriam and Alan seemed to return to normal. Alan had been really ill, though, in February and March, and he was often in bed. But in April, he felt much better and seemed to be getting back to normal. Now, Alan loved to golf, so he really looked forward to getting out on the golf course now that it was getting warmer. And Miriam was taking care of her horses and managing her dance studio. But there was one weird thing. It's that Alan's daughters were having a really hard time getting a hold of their father when they tried to call him, especially Christy, who lived in Denver, and Portia, who lived in Delta. So neither of them understood why their dad just wouldn't call them back. They'd left many messages on his cell phone, and they wondered if maybe he was angry with them for some reason. So then they began to call Miriam's phone and asking her to get a message to Alan. So on June 4th, 2008, Portia left a message on Miriam's voicemail at about 10:30 a.m. Christy, who was planning to visit Alan and Miriam in Whitewater soon, called on June 6th at 8:29 p.m. And she left a message saying that she'd been trying to reach Alan for over a week and had not heard back from him. So she asked Miriam to pass on the message to her father. And the next day, Christy left a message again on Miriam's voicemail. This was at noontime. The next morning, June 8th, at around 9 o'clock, Christy phoned again and left Miriam a message on her cell phone. And she said she'd left several messages on her dad's voicemail, and she really wanted to talk to him about her upcoming visit.
I'm just wondering, they live close enough to their father. Why didn't one of them just go over?
Right. No, I'm with you. I wonder too.
And if I've been trying for weeks to get a hold of you, I wouldn't call your mother to say, do you know how to get a hold of Jill? She wouldn't tell me anyway.
No. Well, yeah, I see what you're saying. There's some weirdness in this family dynamics, for sure.
Plus, it was Portia's husband who stayed at their house.
Yes.
While he was on call.
Yeah, so she knew her dad was okay, so maybe that's why she didn't show up. Yeah, she just wanted to talk to him.
It sounds like they're pretty worried about why they haven't heard from him, or why he wouldn't return calls.
Well, I think they're worried that he's angry with them or something, but I don't think they're really worried about his well-being at that point.
No, I'm sure they're not.
Right. So I guess that's it.
But still, we would have gone over and said, hey, what's up?
Well, yeah, it's an odd dynamic in the family, and there were a lot of strained relationships, although he seemed to have a decent relationship with his daughters. The son was kind of a different story.
Yes, we'll get into that.
Yeah. So let's go to June 10th. This is the day that Alan died. Miriam left the house at around 8:15 a.m. to run some errands, and she went to Walmart first, where she called her horse trainer, Sue Bulware, from her cell phone. and she told her that she'd be sending her a check that day for horse training. And then just after 9 a.m., Miriam called Alan from the Walmart parking lot, and she left a voice message on his cell phone. She told him she loves him, and she talked about buying groceries and picking up a prescription for him. Then she said she would meet him at a Chinese restaurant because she decided she didn't want Mexican food after all, which I guess was their original plan. So Miriam went across town to a Safeway store where she bought carrots for her horses. She called Alan's cell phone again just before 10 a.m. and left another voicemail. She said, "Hi, haven't heard from you." Then she talked about a horse bit that she wanted to exchange, and it was all kind of humdrum type stuff. And she asked him to call her back. Then Miriam drove to City Market in Grand Junction. She called Alan again around 10:30, got his voicemail again. Now this time Miriam sounded a little bit irritated with him. She told him that he needed to answer his phone, and then she went to a bookstore to buy some coloring books for Alan's granddaughters. Miriam then drove to a Chinese restaurant around 11 a.m., and at 11:15 she called Alan again because he hadn't shown up. This time she did sound worried when she left a voicemail. She said, "Hey, this isn't funny anymore." She said she'd been sitting in front of the Chinese restaurant for 15 minutes and he was never late. So she decided to go home then, and if he got caught up on business, she said he should call her when he got home. And then she hung up.
So once Miriam arrived at their house in Whitewater, she couldn't carry all of her groceries into the house at one time. She brought her purse in with a few shopping bags, and then walked through the laundry room from the garage as she normally did. She first noticed an overturned trash can, and then she saw Alan's legs on the floor. Turned around the corner and saw Alan lying on his back, motionless. She dropped her purse and bag and went to Alan's side. Nothing there. She panicked, got her cell phone out, and called 911. Miriam told the operator that she had just returned home from shopping and found her husband dead on the kitchen floor. And despite Miriam being fairly convinced that Alan was dead, she agreed to do CPR, and the operator walked her through it. Alan did not respond to whatever efforts Miriam made. Nobody knows about that.
Well, yeah.
Because it was suspicious that she actually never did any CPR on him.
That would be kind of the thought process by a lot of people in the end, right?
Right.
So County Deputy John Brownlee was with another deputy on a traffic stop when he got the message about this call from the 911 operator. This was about a man in Whitewater who was unconscious and bleeding at his home. So Deputy Brownlee left the other officer at the traffic stop and he drove to Whitewater. When he got to the house, the garage door was open. He went to the front door, opened it, and announced that he was entering. He could hear somebody inside, so he did go in. And there was a man lying on his back in the kitchen with a woman kneeling by his left side. Dispatch had told him that the woman had been doing CPR on the man, but when he looked at Miriam, she wasn't doing anything. And she wasn't crying. So she's just kneeling there. She did have some tears in her eyes, but seemed kind of calm, a little too calm for what he thought she should be. And Brownlee asked Miriam if there was anyone else in the house. She said she didn't know. So he thought, well, the first thing I'm going to do is check the house. So he did a search of the house and found that there was no one else there.
And since Brownlee had arrived before the paramedics, he checked Alan, who was pulseless and cold to the touch. He's dead. Brownlee did notice that a trash can was tipped over and the cabinet drawers were open. There was also a shell casing lying on the floor. He took photos of it and speculated that Alan might have been shot. Neither Miriam nor the dispatcher had mentioned that. Then he noticed that there was a small dog in the residence, and not wanting the dog to mess up the scene, he put the dog in a room and shut the door, and the dog never barked at him. So Brownlee didn't know if this was because Miriam was there or not, and he wondered if the dog would have barked at an intruder. After 2 more deputies arrived, Brownlee asked that Miriam go outside with one of them to answer a few questions. She left her purse inside, and Deputy Brownlee did not allow Miriam to take her purse with her because he wanted it to be retained for evidentiary purposes.
Well, sure, this is probably a crime scene, and they really have no idea what happened yet, so you're not going to let anyone take anything out of the place.
Absolutely.
Now, once Miriam was out of the house, Brownlee took pictures of Alan lying on the floor. And now he could see how much blood was behind Alan's head, and he would later describe it as a lot of blood. So one thing did seem really strange to him. If Miriam had been doing CPR like she told the operator she was, there should have been a lot of blood on her clothing. But Brownlee didn't notice any blood on Miriam's outfit, and even maybe more suspicious, her hands weren't bloody. So if she had turned him and had her hand behind his head like you do when you open the airway, she should have had a lot of blood on her hand at least.
Should have. There was plenty of blood there, right? Brownlee described it as a lot.
A lot of blood. There was a puddle. So that afternoon, Josh Vigil, Alan's son-in-law, who was married to Portia and stayed at the house a lot, came to the house, and he was filled in on what had happened there. Now, he got quite upset, much more than Miriam. She'd been maybe teary-eyed, but not visibly upset or in shock. Miriam had seemed very calm, answering questions and obeying without complaining. So this was odd to Brownlee, considering what she just walked in on. But everyone responds differently, so he tried to hold his judgment back. But it did seem strange.
Certainly did. So that afternoon, Miriam was taken to the Mesa County Sheriff's Office to be interviewed. She still had on the same pair of jeans, t-shirt, and shoes that she had been wearing when she found Alan dead on the floor of their home. So Miriam and a female detective named Beverly Jarrell sat down to talk as the interview was videotaped. Out of view of the camera, Detective Danny Norris was sitting on a chair a few feet away. Miriam seemed to be on the verge of tears, so she was given a box of Kleenex. And Detective Jarrell asked Miriam to start from when she woke up that morning and go over what she was doing until she found her husband in their home unresponsive.
Well, Miriam said that she and Alan got up around the same time. She made coffee, and the two of them went out to sit on the deck and talk about their plans for that day. Miriam said that she and Alan had several errands to run separately. She explained that Alan was self-employed, and he had a long list of things to do, which were businessy things, like he had to go to a power company in Clifton about some land he planned to develop there. She estimated that he had about a dozen things to do that day. So Detective Jarrell asked if anyone else was at the house that morning, and Miriam explained that their son-in-law Josh was staying with them, but that he had actually left for work before 6 a.m., so he was long gone. Josh stayed in an apartment-like area of their house downstairs where he had his own kitchenette, so they didn't see an awful lot of him. So when questioned about their relationship with Josh, Miriam said it was okay, it was fine. Josh was married to Alan's daughter Portia, and Portia lived in Delta, which was about 25 miles away. Miriam said that Alan had two other daughters, Christy, and she lived in Seattle, and Wendy, who lived in Denver. So the three daughters were in their 30s, and Gerald wanted to know if Miriam had any of her own children. And she said she did. She had a son named Chris, who lived in Florida.
Yeah, the whole discussion led them back to Josh, and Miriam said that because of his irregular hours, he was at their house 1 or 2 days a week. He was on call for his job with Halliburton, and his hours were variable. She and Alan had talked over their plans for the day, and then he had gone to take a shower. Miriam had then taken their Oldsmobile to do her own errands at a little after 8 in the morning. Miriam said that she drove to City Market, where she bought 2 packs of cigarettes and a soft drink. From the parking lot, she called Sue Boulware, who was her horse trainer. Miriam said she talked with Sue about Alan's granddaughter's upcoming riding lesson. She said that she went to a Walmart to buy shirts, barn shirts she called them. These are just rather inexpensive shirts that would get dirty out in the barn. And along the way she'd called Alan on her cell phone, but he didn't answer, so she left a voicemail. From there she went to buy carrots to feed the horses. Miriam said she bought a large bag of carrots at a Safeway in Grand Junction, and then drove to a bookstore across town to buy coloring books for Alan's granddaughters. And she told Gerald that it wasn't really unusual for Alan not to answer or return her call. She assumed he was caught up with business. Now, I kind of know what's going on at the end of this, but why would you drive all that way to buy just a single bag of carrots for the horses and then come back and go to a bookstore across the other part of town to buy coloring books?
Yeah, I think you could buy coloring books when you're at the Walmart, right?
It seems to me that she's trying to establish an alibi.
Oh, Dickie, come on.
How's that?
You're such a skeptic.
Yes, I am.
Well, yeah, there's a lot fishy about this that we haven't even discussed yet. But, usually people said that this couple was always together and went and did their errands together. Remember, she'd been with him when he was signing paper when the car fire had happened.
Right. They were always together.
It seemed like it. So a lot of it's not going to add up, and I think your alibi statement could be true. So she said after the bookstore, she went to the Chinese restaurant where they were supposed to meet for lunch. And Gerald asked how long Miriam had waited there for Alan. And she said she waited until about 11:15 and then she drove home. She said by that time she was kind of worried about Alan because he wasn't in the best of health. So the interview then moved on to how Miriam had found Alan in the house. So Miriam kind of dabbed at her eyes and sniffled before she spoke, and she said that she saw blood under his head and didn't know what had happened. She said she kind of shook him to try and wake him up, and then she called 911. She said they kept her on the phone for a long time and she was trying to do CPR, but it didn't work. So Gerald was like, well, back up. So you drive up to the house. What do you do with your car? Miriam says she parked in the garage and everything appeared normal. After entering and turning the corner coming out of the laundry room, she saw Alan on the floor near the wall lying on his back. His arms were out by his side and one of them was touching a liquor cabinet. Gerald gave Miriam a pen and had her kind of sketch out that scene for her. Miriam said that she saw Alan's wallet and that some drawers were pulled out of the cabinets and desk, kind of implying maybe this had been a robbery.
Exactly. And then when the interview turned to what Alan kept in his wallet, Miriam said that he had a couple credit cards, his license, and usually a couple $100 or so in cash. Alan was the primary holder on both cards. Miriam added that she and Alan had been married for 2 years and that they had a prenup. Everything was in Alan's name. According to Miriam, the prenup said that she didn't have rights to the things Alan had owned before they were married. Those assets were to go to his kids. Miriam said that the prenup had been her suggestion because his daughters were starting to accept her, and she didn't want them to think that she was with Alan only for his money.
Well, Gerald asked her then if the doors to their house were usually locked, and she was surprised when Miriam told her, well, no, they never locked them, because Alan didn't think it was necessary. Alan didn't even know that they had keys to the house until a couple of months before, and they'd never had any trouble there. She also denied that Alan had any enemies, but then she said she really didn't know too much about his business dealings. When asked if there were any firearms in the house, Miriam paused, and she said, yeah, Alan did have a rifle. I believe it was a .22. Then she said that he used it when they had problems with prairie dogs. Then she remembered that he also had a shotgun and a handgun in a box. Miriam said that the handgun was small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, and that Alan had kept it on a back shelf in a closet, along with some bullets. Detective Gerald wanted to know if Miriam stayed home most of the time, and she said yes, she did, and that she and Alan normally traveled around together, unless he was doing business. If it was just for running errands around the area, she said, yeah, we usually do that together.
Then asked if Alan had a will. Miriam said that she had an attorney. Miriam said that he had an attorney, but she didn't know his name. Miriam said that Alan wrote up the prenup himself, and she signed it. And asked about Alan's health, Miriam explained that he had quit smoking a year ago. He was on Wellbutrin for emotional issues, but also could have been for cessation of smoking. And he also had hypertension. Then Gerald asked if Alan had a son, and Miriam said he did. Alan Jr. was living in Alaska and had not been on good terms with Alan Sr. Jr. was supposed to be coming to Denver to meet his sister Christy at the airport, and then they were coming to Whitewater to visit. According to Miriam, Alan was only planning to let Alan Jr. stay with them for a few nights because of the problems between them. Alan had tried to keep Jr. at arm's distance, Miriam said, because there was always a disagreement or something going on between the two of them. Miriam thought that Alan had last spoken to Jr. about a week and a half ago. Miriam thought he was flying to Denver and would then make arrangements with Christy. Christy was going to fly to Denver, rent a car, and they both would come out together. Miriam didn't know how old Alan Jr. was, but she thought he was probably in his early 40s.
So that's a little funny, too.
Yes, it is. Granted, there might be some estrangement going on.
Yeah, but wouldn't you think you and your partner would discuss what children you have and how old they are and what the issues are?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would think so. Now, when asked if Alan had ever talked about his problems with Alan Jr. with her, Miriam said yes, he had told her something about it. He had told her that He had told Alan Jr. in the past not to show up unexpectedly because Alan didn't want him to know where they lived. Then she added that Alan tried to be very guarded about his son but he was stressed out every time Alan Jr. even called him. And he had told Miriam that if Alan Jr. ever showed up, she should call the cops immediately.
Huh.
Yeah, so Miriam told the detective that Alan supported the mom in an adoption of Alan Jr.'s daughter. So Alan Jr. had, of course, been very upset about that. Alan had actually told the judge that his son, Alan Jr., had no business being a father because he was not a responsible person.
Well, that's harsh.
Yeah, so I wish I knew more about how that all happened, because it would have to be pretty serious, I would think, to turn on your son like that.
I would think.
So it wasn't just a little rift, that was a big rift, and I think the detective wondered why Miriam hadn't mentioned that sooner.
Oh, yeah.
Because Alan Jr. is definitely going to be investigated.
Yeah, until the detective asked specifically, Miriam just said, oh, yeah, 3 daughters.
I know. It's really odd.
So anyway, Alan Jr. would definitely be investigated. The detective moved on to Josh. This is the son-in-law who stayed frequently with Miriam and Alan. Gerald asked how Josh accessed the house, and Miriam told her that he used a downstairs door. She added that he pretty much had his own apartment downstairs. She didn't see him very often in the main part of the house. She would sometimes see him in the evening when she and Alan fed the horses. Then, when asked if Josh had any firearms, Miriam said, well, I don't know. She also said she hadn't seen Josh in 4 days. She had called his wife, Portia, to see if Josh was all right, and Portia told her that Josh had some time off from work and he was up in Delta with her. Detective Gerald then asked Miriam if she knew anyone that might want Alan dead. Miriam said she didn't know, but he had had a dispute with the sprinkler guy recently. Yeah, that's a reason to kill someone.
Yeah.
Alan wanted a bill in writing, never got one, so he withheld payment. And they went back and forth on this issue for several weeks, and then Alan finally paid them off.
Yeah, so if he'd paid it, that's not really a motive anymore, even though it was not a very strong motive to begin with.
It would seem not to be a motive anymore, right?
Yeah. So Miriam did admit that Alan had a life insurance policy, but she said it was only to pay off creditors in case Alan died unexpectedly. She thought that it was for $100,000, and she told detectives that Alan owed $275,000 to investors on one set of loans and $140,000 on a banknote. As far as how much money he had in the bank, she thought he had about $100,000. But remember, she just said a couple minutes ago that she didn't know much about his finances or business. And now she seems to know quite a bit.
She rattled off some statistics right there.
Yeah. So it's about 3:30 p.m. when Miriam says, "You asked me a bunch of questions about where I was this morning. I have a bunch of receipts in my pants pocket. Would that help?" So here goes your whole alibi thing. She's got all her receipts ready to show them.
See?
She gave Detective Gerald a handful of receipts. She also pulled some cash from her pocket and said that was what was left of the money that Alan had given her that morning. Gerald had Miriam leave the money on the table because Miriam's clothing was going to be taken. Her hands were swabbed for gunshot residue, and she changed out of her clothes and into some clothing that Gerald gave her. Then the interview was over.
And the medical examiner, Dr. Kurtzman, did Alan's autopsy the next day. Kurtzman noted a wound where a bullet had entered the back of Alan's head. From lack of stippling and soot on his skin, Dr. Kurtzman believed that the shooter was at least 2 feet away from Alan when the shot was fired. The bullet was recovered from the right frontal area of Alan's brain, so it would have caused Alan's death within seconds, and he certainly would have been instantly incapacitated. The trajectory of the bullet's path made Alan fall where his body had been found. There's a bump on the back of his head, consistent with him falling onto the floor. Kurtzman noted that Alan did not have any defensive wounds in his hands.
No, it seemed like he was taken by surprise, right?
Right.
Yeah. So toxicology revealed that Alan had caffeine and cotinine in his body. So coffee and cigarettes. He didn't have any alcohol in his system. Dr. Kurtzman determined that Alan had died a few hours before the first officers arrived. So official cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head, and the manner of death was classified as a homicide.
Yeah, the investigators transcribed phone messages that had been received on Alan's cell phone. Besides the messages left by Miriam on the morning of June 10th, there were others. 9:29 a.m., Alan's daughter Portia called him, but he didn't answer. She left a message saying, "Hi, Dad. I hate to bother you so much. It's just I haven't been able to talk to you, so things are piling up. I have a verification that I need you to fill out. Call me. That would be great. Thanks. Bye." Then there were several messages later in the day asking if Alan was okay, because friends and acquaintances had heard there was a robbery at the Helmick house. And there was also at least one call from a collection agency.
Yeah. Well, one of the many people who investigators interviewed was Trish Erickson, who had actually known Alan for several years. She'd lived in Delta for 25 years, and she cleaned houses for money. She had originally met Alan and his first wife, Sharon, when she used to work as a waitress. In 2004, she was cleaning houses, and Alan called her and asked if she wanted to clean his office building, and she did. So after Alan and Miriam moved to Whitewater, Trish went back and forth to clean their house once a month. It was usually the last Monday of the month. Miriam and Alan were in and out of the house a lot, according to Trish. Trish had been at the Helmick's home on June 9th, 2008, the day before Alan was murdered. She usually saw Alan and Miriam when she first got there, but on June 9th, Alan and Miriam were out doing something when she arrived. The door was unlocked like it usually was, and Trish went in and started her work cleaning the house. So Trish remembered that she'd gotten there about 10 a.m., and she started in the living room and ended in the bedroom. When Alan was home, he would normally chat with Trish. She was in the master bedroom when they came home, and she said Alan didn't even say hello to her. Miriam rushed in, and Alan was sitting silently at a desk near the patio. Trish thought Alan was behaving very strangely. He'd always been talkative and friendly with her, but now it's like he wouldn't even look at her. When Alan finally got up, he walked right past Miriam, and Trish said he had a very sour look on his face. Trish could feel that things were tense between the couple, but of course she had no idea why. So this was interesting. It seems like this couple was not getting along very well the day before his death.
Yeah, there's some kind of issue between them.
Yes.
So a background check done by investigators on Miriam showed some interesting things, putting it mildly. Miriam had lived in Jacksonville, Florida, and while living there, she had been married to Jack Giles, who had committed suicide on March 15, 2002. Before that, their daughter Amy Giles, who was 23 at the time, had died on August 29, 2000, of an accidental prescription drug overdose. Miriam had 2 liens and judgments against her. There is a federal tax lien of more than $20,000 from the year 2007 and a civil lien in the state of Georgia for $9,731. She had lived around Jacksonville, Florida during the 90s until about 2004. In 2003 and 2004, several court actions were started against Miriam. A finance company sued her, and Miriam had to turn over a boat motor, and a trailer to them. American Express filed a suit against Miriam and Jack Giles for $68,189. Miriam sold her home to help with these costs. Then she moved in with her father and stepmother in the Jacksonville area after the death of her husband.
Yeah, so Portia told investigators that it was not like her father to owe money to anyone, and she also told them about how her father had not been returning her or her sister's calls for months. Portia said that Miriam had made arrangements for Portia's 9-year-old daughter to have riding lessons at the Helmick's home every Tuesday at noon. So Portia's daughter had had her first lesson on June 3rd. Alan and Miriam had picked her up the night before, and she'd spent the night there, and the next day Portia's daughter had her riding lesson at noon, just as scheduled. But then on June 9th, Portia had tried calling her father to ask if he was picking up her daughter for the next lesson, which was scheduled for the 10th. But of course Portia couldn't reach him, so she left a message on his cell phone. Portia then had called Miriam's cell phone and left a message. Miriam called Portia back later that day and said that the new horse trainer was having a problem with a horse which her daughter rode. So Miriam wanted to cancel the riding lesson for June 10th and reschedule it for Friday, June 13th. Now, when Portia got Miriam's message, she was upset, but she was okay with June 13th. Portia said that she wanted to speak with her father right then, but Miriam told her that Alan had gone to an appointment and then planned to stop off at Portia's house on the way back. So Portia said this is strange because her father never just dropped by. And Alan didn't come to Portia's house on June 9th, so Portia called Miriam back. Now this time Miriam said that she had told Alan to call Portia, but no call came in either. So concerned, Portia called her husband Josh, who had plans to spend the night at the Helmick house after work. Once Josh got there, he called Portia from the Helmick house and said that from where he stood, he could see Miriam and Alan out by the barn. Miriam called Portia later that night and told her that Alan had stopped by the Elks Lodge in Delta to pay his dues, and then he had arrived home really drunk, so she'd had to put him to bed. But Portia thought this was just very unlikely. She'd never known her father to drink and drive. Portia didn't question Miriam at the time, but she did call back her husband Josh. And Josh told her that Alan did not seem drunk when he saw him out by the barn. So Portia tried calling Alan on the morning of June 10th. But of course the call went straight to voicemail. Portia then called Miriam's cell phone after that and spoke with her, telling Miriam that she needed to speak with her father. She said there was some important business that he needed to attend to. So I'm with you, Dickie, about why not go to the house?
Yeah, it's not like these girls live hundreds of miles away.
No, and if he hasn't returned my calls in a month?
More than a month.
Yeah, I know. I'm just saying even a month, even a week.
Even a week.
Yeah, but that's what happened. And it seems like Miriam might have lied about the drinking and having to put him to bed, and probably Alan didn't even know that Portia had called.
I'm sure he didn't.
So Miriam had told Portia that she was at Walmart and Alan wasn't with her the next day. Then Miriam said that Alan was picking up a car and they were supposed to meet and have lunch. That was the last time Portia had spoken with Miriam before she heard about the murder of her father. Portia learned about a murder in Whitewater and looked it up online. So that was a horrible way to find out that her father had been killed.
Isn't it?
Yes.
Jeez.
Miriam didn't call her. So in Portia's interview with police, she said that Bob Isom was her father's best friend, and Isom had stopped by her house after getting the news about Alan's murder. So, Isom had told Portia that he had spoken to Alan the previous afternoon, June 9th, about a golf game they had scheduled for the morning of June 10th, and he said that Alan had canceled their golf game because Portia's daughter was coming over for her riding lesson. Portia told him that Miriam had canceled the riding lesson, so this made no sense.
It doesn't, does it?
No, Alan would not have canceled his golf game unless he thought that he was going to go to his granddaughter's riding lesson.
Exactly.
And Miriam had said that it was canceled.
Yeah, just didn't make any sense.
No. Well, it gets worse because the Elks Lodge bartender told investigators that she had known Alan for years, and she was sure he was not at the lodge bar on June 9th. She added that she really hadn't seen Alan or Miriam there for months.
Interesting. So Portia added that her father and Miriam had gone to Portia's daughter's dance recital, which was May 10th. And while there, Portia heard about her father's car fire down in Delta. The strangest part, Portia said, was that Miriam told Portia at the dance recital that the police in Delta suspected Miriam of being involved in the fire. Then Miriam added that this was just ridiculous because she and Alan had a prenuptial agreement. If anything happened to him, Miriam said, she was not going to get anything. According to Miriam, everything that Alan owned was to be split between his children after his death. Miriam added, I'm better off with him alive than dead.
This is very inappropriate conversation,
Isn't
right?
it?
Right after he dies like that?
Now, so Portia believed that her father's life insurance policy, $275,000 worth, would go to his business partners.
Well, some of Alan's family and friends were suspicious that Miriam could have been poisoning Alan before his murder, and this was because of his long period of illness that spring. It was so bad he couldn't get out of bed some days. Dr. Kurtzman had found no evidence of poisoning, but Alan did have severe heart disease. Several people said that Alan had looked better 1 week before his death than he had in a long time. But Dr. Kurtzman said that family and friends might have mistaken his health issues for signs of poisoning, because by the time he had the autopsy, he didn't have any poison in his system.
Right. And he did have evidence of pretty severe heart disease.
Yes.
Which kind of makes you a ticking time bomb.
Yeah, and it can make you very fatigued.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
So it might have been something like that.
Yeah, but then he seemed better in April. So usually heart disease you don't get better from without treatment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true. Detective Jarrell also interviewed the horse trainer, Sue Boulware. She said that she had first been contacted by Miriam in February of that year to train the Helmick's horses. Sue said that on June 9th, the day before the murder, both Alan and Miriam came to the training center to take one of their horses for medical treatment. Sue received a phone call at 8:43 in the morning on June 10th from Miriam, who was calling her on a cell phone while driving. Near the end of the call, Miriam said she was at a store. During the phone call, Miriam said that she would be canceling the appointment for the riding lesson for Alan's granddaughter. Problem with this, again, is that Miriam had told Portia that it was Sue who had canceled the riding lessons because the horse was having problems. Then there were also issues with another horse trainer, who told Detective Jarrell that Miriam had tried to convince her to inflate the training costs to get more money from Alan.
Yeah. It's all not looking good for Miriam.
It doesn't look real good, does it?
No. Alan's daughter Wendy had lived with Miriam and her father at the Whitewater house from May 2006 until June 2007. While she was there, everything seemed to be fine between the couple, she said. But then she recalled that Miriam did start confiscating her father's cell phone and turning the power off. Now, like her sisters, Wendy had a hard time reaching her father by phone after she moved out of his house. Between the time Wendy moved out until March 2008, she only saw her father twice, and she had called on occasion, but she only spoke with him a few times. Wendy added that she would ask her father why he didn't call her back, and that he told her he hadn't received any messages. Wendy said that Miriam always had her father's phone and kept it off. Alan had even told Wendy that Miriam kept his cell phone in her purse. Wendy said she wondered why Miriam had gone out so early on June 10th, because she's not a morning person. While Wendy had lived with them, she never saw Miriam get up early and go out by herself somewhere. Her father was the morning person, but Miriam wouldn't get up until after 10 a.m. Actually, not once while she was living there had Wendy seen her father and Miriam leave the house before 10 in the morning. Now, investigators heard from the police in Florida that Miriam's first husband, Jack Giles, had died violently. Jack and Miriam had been married for 23 years when Jack shot himself in the head while both he and Miriam were in bed together. Jack had been understandably distraught about the death of his daughter 2 years earlier. Mesa County investigator Warner interviewed an officer who was with the Jacksonville Police Department and had investigated the death of Jack Giles. And he said that Jack had been in bed with Miriam when he shot himself. After Jack had shot himself, his thumb was found in the trigger guard. So that was unusual, but the death was quickly determined to be a suicide.
Yeah, investigator Warner was given a report about gunshot residue testing in Jack Giles' case. There was no gunshot residue found on Miriam, but testing had not been done on Jack Giles' hands or clothing. You would think that if you're going to call it a suicide, you might want to do that.
Yeah, it wasn't much of an investigation, and I don't know if it's because this couple's been married so long, and
right.
But still,
sounds like it was just accepted kind of face value.
Yeah, so not a good investigation.
Warner later received copies of 2 reports from the Jacksonville Police Department, and in these reports, Warner learned that Miriam had been investigated for depositing counterfeit checks in January of 2004. Total amount was $6,800. The report read that Miriam eventually admitted to depositing and cashing the counterfeit checks.
Well, we're going to find that Miriam had quite a history of embezzlement and counterfeiting and forgery.
Boy, she sure has.
Yeah. So investigator Warner also checked on when Miriam had been in Gulfport, Mississippi, before she moved to Colorado. While living there, Miriam had gone under the name of Francesca Miriam Giles. Warner found that there were 3 court cases involving Miriam in 2005 alone. Court documents from Gulfport showed that in 2 cases, Miriam had been charged with embezzlement. The date of the charges was November 12, 2004, and according to the documents, Miriam was found not guilty on all the charges. But a big reason why the charges were not pursued further was that Hurricane Katrina had hit Gulfport, Mississippi around that same time. So they had bigger fish to fry, obviously. Gulfport Police Department charges on the incidents were that Miriam had been investigated for taking money from Barbara Watts, who owned a dance studio there where Miriam had worked. Miriam then left Gulfport for Colorado before she was arrested, but because of the hurricane, the charges were ultimately dropped completely. Miriam had apparently stolen from the owner of a dance studio where she had worked at in Gulfport. The owner, a woman who had really considered Miriam a friend, had missing checks that Miriam forged and cashed. Miriam had also asked her students to pay her in cash so that she could keep the money. So she was taking money from this woman she worked for who thought she was her friend. It's not good. Not a good look for Miriam.
Nice friend.
Yes.
Well, there's more.
Oh, yes, there's a lot more.
On June 12th, 2 days after Alan's death, Miriam told a friend that maybe there was a person at the dance studio that had taken money, and maybe Alan had found out about it. Then Miriam told her that Alan was an asshole to her for the last couple of weeks before the murder. She said that she had to hide money at the dance studio so she wouldn't be broke. Then in a sarcastic tone, Miriam said, "Sure, I'm going to miss him." Then she laughed. This wasn't the only instance of Miriam acting oddly after her husband's murder. Several people noticed that over a week after the murder, Miriam still had not cleaned up the bloodstains off the floor in the house. She was living there with a couple towels lying over that area.
Yeah, she's a real piece of work.
Miriam had claimed that because of her and Alan's prenup, she would receive nothing when he died. But it wasn't exactly as she stated. It was just on a piece of paper, had not been notarized. There was a $25,000 policy naming her as a beneficiary. Miriam had tried to purchase a larger policy in early 2008 for $2 million, but the agent told her that Alan would have to sign papers, and then she backed out. Because obviously, or maybe not obviously, she just didn't want Alan to know about it.
Well, that's suspicious right there. I would think if a spouse comes in to buy life insurance, but doesn't want her husband to know about it, right? I would call him and let him know.
It's a birthday present.
Right. We have heard that in other cases, actually. People will say anything.
All right, they will.
Now, just 6 days after Alan's murder, Miriam called the agent to ask how she could cash in on that $25,000 policy. But the agent told Miriam she couldn't, because monthly payments had been missed by Alan over the spring of 2008. And Alan had missed those payments because Miriam was keeping his phone messages and his mail hidden from him. And she was doing that clearly because she was doing things financially he wouldn't have agreed with. So on June 22nd, this is almost 2 weeks after his murder, Miriam started telling her friend Penny about some strange things that had been happening at her house in Whitewater. She said some lights were on when she came home that she was sure she had left off. Cabinet doors that she hadn't opened were opened. Items were moved to different locations in her home. She said she was afraid, but she really had no place else to go. Then on June 26th, Penny was at work when she got a phone call from Miriam. She had gone out earlier that day, and she said she really didn't want to go back to the house alone because all those things had been happening. So Penny was a good friend. Penny told her that she would be out of work soon, and Miriam could go to her house and hang out there until Penny got home, and then the two women would run some errands together. So they had a really nice afternoon together, according to Penny. But when they got back to Penny's house, she followed Miriam home to make sure she got in safely. But once at Miriam's, Penny walked up to the house with her, and she saw this yellow envelope poking out from beneath the welcome mat. So Penny picked up the envelope, and on the front of the envelope, in block print, it read, "To the grieving widow." Penny opened the card with Miriam, and inside was written, "Alan was first, you're next. Run, run, run." Now Alan and the word "your" were both misspelled, so this really frightened Penny. And according to Penny, Miriam seemed terrified also. She was visibly shaking. Penny worried that someone was watching them. They both started running for the car, and Penny threw the card into the back seat of the car. Penny wanted to call 911 immediately, but Miriam didn't want her to. Miriam told her she wanted to call her attorney instead. So Penny thought that was really weird.
Yes, it was, wasn't it? Now, the very next day, Friday, June 27th, investigators received a message from Miriam's attorney, Colleen Scissors. The attorney said that Miriam wanted her to report suspicious activity at the Helmick house. She said that Miriam believed someone had entered her house several times when she wasn't at home, and scissors turned over the threatening card to the police. It was a greeting card. On the front of the card was a drawing of a woman sitting in a chair reading a book. Next to the picture it read, "Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results." The section of the card with the UPC code had been cut out.
Yeah, so that just seems weird.
Very weird.
A detective followed up with research on a website of the greeting card creator. There were several stores in Grand Junction, in the Grand Junction area, that sold the creator's cards. But he was actually able to narrow this down, that this particular card was only sold at a couple of places in Grand Junction. So it only took a couple of days, and the police were able to track down CCTV footage of Miriam buying that card herself. Now, of course, they'd been suspicious from the start. What kind of killer would buy a greeting card and leave it by the door? It was just weird.
Right.
Very suspicious. Working with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, the Mesa County Sheriff's Office was able to find out about more of Miriam's financial escapades, too. Miriam had actually defrauded her own parents in the recent past. Francis Morgan, Miriam's father, had filed a police complaint with the Jacksonville Police Department in October of 2004. Miriam had forged a check to a made-up company she called Showcase Dancewear. And over a matter of months, Miriam had written checks for a total of over $5,000 payable to Showcase Dancewear. From CCTV footage at the bank, the suspect was described as a white adult female. The woman on the tape and the photo on Miriam's driver's license were used to identify this as Miriam. So Miriam's father and stepmother said they had not written checks against a credit card account in 2004, but $32,000 in checks had been forged to take cash from that credit card account. So these aren't small amounts of money.
Not insignificant at all.
No. Now, for over 4 years, they were dealing with Miriam committing fraud on their accounts. She'd actually moved into their house after her first husband, Jack Giles, had committed suicide, and she'd stayed for about 8 weeks. So this is just really evil, because Miriam's father had heart surgery, and her stepmother was getting treatment for cancer at this time. And Miriam said, "Oh yeah, I'll take care of everything." She volunteered to take care of the bills for them, and they thought, well, that's just great. What a good daughter. But then after Miriam moved out, she continued visiting every day, right at noon. The couple then thought it was just very considerate that Miriam visited so often. But later, they realized that Miriam had just come every day at that time so she could get access to their mail. So this is just a betrayal.
What a schemer.
This is her father, right?
Yeah.
Who had a health problem.
Certainly did. So when Miriam's father called her about the missing money from their accounts, she said, "I'm going to come over to your house after work and explain everything." But she never showed. It happens that right after the phone call, Miriam left work and went home. She took her dogs in a packed bag and disappeared. But that's only the beginning.
Yes, it gets a lot worse.
That same night, their house was set on fire. Miriam's stepmother told the police that it was just too much of a coincidence that their house was set on fire the same night that Miriam disappeared.
Well, you think?
Their house had a screened-in back porch, and Miriam's father had some oily rags out there. Someone had set these rags on fire in the middle of the night. Obviously arson. Fortunately, there was a big hanging plant in a plastic pot above the area where the fire had been set. The fire melted the plastic pot, which was full of water, and the water spilled out and put out the fire. Amazing. At the time, they didn't know that Miriam had taken off, but they learned the next day when they spoke to Miriam's landlord.
Okay, so this woman will stop at nothing. Okay, she's already stolen from these older people dealing with illness, and they weren't super wealthy. And then she sets this fire in the middle of the night, which to me is attempted murder, of course.
It is.
Right? You set someone's house on fire when they're in bed?
If the fire hadn't been put out, could have killed him.
Oh, absolutely. A few days later, Miriam sent an email to her father. She claimed that she was in Maryland and would explain one day what had happened. After some time passed, her father learned that Miriam had not gone to Maryland at all, but she was in Mobile, Alabama, where Miriam's mother lived. And Miriam had allegedly stolen $7,000 from her mother before she moved on to Gulfport, Mississippi. In Gulfport, Miriam had stolen checks from an employer, and she'd cashed them and then moved again. Everyone who Miriam had stolen from had been completely surprised by these crimes. They'd all been friends and family. She had no known history of mental illness, though, and she really came across as a normal, honest person. She was able to pull that off quite well. The police checked into Alan's banking activities before his death, and they found that Miriam had been signing and cashing some of Alan's checks, while she wasn't authorized to do that. Now, the bank had tried to reach Alan about overdrafts, but of course they could never reach him. They left multiple voicemails, which Miriam must have erased. A representative planned to go and see Alan in person, but then Alan was killed before that could happen. The same representative had seen Alan Helmick at the courthouse in Grand Junction a couple of months before his death. He had talked with Alan then and told him that he had left at least 20 messages on Alan's cell phone. Alan told him that he'd never gotten any messages. Then he said that Miriam may have gotten them and forgot to tell him. So I don't know, Alan can't be a stupid guy. I guess he's just in love with her.
I guess he just doesn't want to think that she could have done that.
Exactly.
Because the evidence is there.
It really seems pretty clear.
Now, after that, a flag had been put on Alan's account. Miriam came in and tried to cash one of Alan's checks, and the teller referred her to the bank manager. Miriam told the manager that Alan had been very sick, but that she would tell him what was going on. The investigators later found a letter to Alan from American National Bank, dated June 6th, 4 days before Alan's murder, and it read in part that Alan had 2 accounts that were past due. The letter notified him that $137,000 was set off from Alan's deposit account to pay down his loans, leaving an account balance of 0. And after applying the set-off amount, Alan still owed over $15,000 on one account and almost $22,000 on the other account. The bank was demanding immediate payment, but Alan's family, friends, and business partners all said it was not like Alan to not pay his debts or to ignore financial issues.
Well, yeah, and if that wasn't suspicious enough, investigators learned that both of Miriam's businesses had been losing money, and these were the dance studio and the horse training center, of course. Checks forged by Miriam included a check dated February 7th, 2008 for $5,000 to Miriam Helmick, and a check dated May 1st, 2008 for $4,000 to Dance Junction. Miriam had been transferring funds from Alan's personal checking account to the Dance Junction account without Alan's knowledge. She was also preventing American National Bank from contacting Alan about his loan accounts with the bank. So he very likely knew nothing about any of this. Or maybe he found out right before his murder. So you just had to wonder, did Miriam kill him herself to stay out of trouble? The more the police learned, the more likely this seemed. The housekeeper had commented on Alan seeming upset the day before his death. So they wondered, had he just learned about Miriam's financial betrayals? Did he want to break up with her and get a divorce then? And what was she doing with all this money is another good question.
Right, well, I mean, it's not a ton. It's a significant amount, but it's not like she went out and bought a Mercedes.
Well, no, but she doesn't have to pay a mortgage or rent or anything. Right. He's taking care of her.
Maybe she's squirreling it away.
No, because she had nothing.
Huh, what'd she spend it on?
That's what I just said.
Okay.
I don't know what she spent it on. Just junk, I guess. Who knows?
So Miriam's brought into the police station to give samples of saliva and hair, and was also asked to give handwriting examples. It was impossible to match her writing because the card had been written on in block print. They did, however, notice that the greeting card and her police sample both spelled Y-O-U''RE as Y-O-U-R.
That's one of my pet peeves when people do that.
Yeah, and the signatures that were forged on Alan's checks matched Miriam's handwriting. So it would seem that the walls are closing in on her.
Well, about time, really, if you think about it. That July, Miriam left Colorado. No one seemed to know where she was, but she was finally located at her son's house down in Jacksonville, Florida. She'd taken off with a car that had belonged to Alan's late wife Sharon after she sold off a lot of things from his house, anything pretty much she could get cash for. Meanwhile, police experts were searching Miriam and Alan's computer searches. There'd been about 30 searches on May 18th, 2008, with the keywords, how to put a horse down. There had also been searches for horse euthanasia procedures, barbiturate painkillers, painkiller overdoses, and halcyon drug overdose. This was concerning because family members had been suspicious that Miriam had been poisoning Alan, remember? Someone had also read an article on one of their computers that was titled, More Drug Overdose Deaths from Painkillers Than Cocaine or Heroin in the U.S. And let's remember how her daughter died.
Right, prescription drug.
Only 8 years before this.
Yep.
On May 19th, someone had been on Best RX Farm. The shopping cart had 60 Ambien 10 milligram pills and 30 Ambien 10 milligram pills. The total order was $388. There was a similar order for triazolam and OxyContin at that website. So someone had been really interested in these drugs. Someone had also searched for Ambien overdose, Ambien CR and alcohol, Ambien death, and accidental death ruled in death of Joliet detective.
Well, someone in the Helmick house had been very interested in medication overdoses and euthanasia in May and June of 2008.
Yeah, and they did talk to the horse trainers and people that dealt with their horses. They didn't have a sick horse. There was no horse that would need to be put down.
There.
Yeah.
Also remember that during early 2008, Alan had been showing signs of illness or drug misuse. So if Miriam had been the person on the internet looking for these things, you would certainly get the idea that she was trying to kill her husband.
Oh, absolutely. So there's another interesting thing. The handgun that had been owned by Alan and used in his murder had a really interesting story behind it, which would help in the investigation. Investigators contacted Mike Pruitt, who was Sharon Helmick's brother-in-law. Pruitt told them about an incident in Delta, Colorado, back in the 1980s, when a neighbor had to wrestle a handgun away from Sharon's stepfather, Jerry Waite. So in the struggle for the gun, Jerry Waite had a heart attack and died. A .25 caliber handgun had been recovered from the scene, and photos were taken of it. So this Jerry had gotten into an argument, and he was actually firing that gun at his wife, Wanda, and also at a neighbor, Terry Helm. Jerry had been standing in the front yard when he fired at them. Now Terry Helm's husband, Daniel Helm, ran over and knocked Jerry over and was able to get the gun away from him. The gun contained a magazine of 6 live rounds and 1 spent shell casing. So this pistol was believed to have been passed to Sharon Helmick and then to Alan Helmick after Sharon died. There was a very good possibility that this was the same pistol that was later used to murder Alan Helmick. But then police learned that the bullets had been shot into the ground during that altercation. And miraculously, investigators were able to dig up a bullet for examination in 2008. The examination of the bullet was performed by a Colorado Bureau of Investigation ballistics expert. So the bullets had similar characteristics and could have been fired by the same gun, but unfortunately there was too much damage to the bullet in the ground to make an absolute determination. But both bullets did have the same characteristics of being fired from that same make of pistol, and police files showed that after her father's death, Sharon Helmick had asked for that pistol to be released to her custody. A letter was also in the file that indicated that the pistol had been given to Sharon. So that's pretty amazing.
That's interesting. Wow. So investigators on Alan's murder case received a packet of documents from the Delta Police Department relating to the car fire that had occurred just before his murder. They also received an audio CD of the interview with Alan and Miriam Helmick about the incident. The interviews happened on May 1st, 2008. During the interview, Miriam said that a woman named Barbara Watts was the only person she could think of who might have wanted to start a car fire, but she didn't know if Watts was in town that day. When asked if she had any criminal history or was being investigated about anything, Miriam said, not me. Miriam had filled the gas tank of Alan's Buick on April 26th on her own, and both Miriam and Alan agreed that Miriam rarely drove the car. Miriam was asked why the bathroom she had been in that day smelled like lighter fluid when officers went in there. And Miriam said, "Oh, it's because Alan gave me the wick after the car fire and told me to do something with it. So I threw it in a garbage can. Alan then told me to get it back out later, which I did." So here's Miriam in Florida with her son, at the same time she's being investigated for Alan's murder.
Well, yeah, but you know what? She's already looking for her next husband.
Well, you gotta have a plan here, girl. Charles Kirkpatrick, a wealthy man who owned 2 dance studios, was on the internet dating sites seekingarrangement.com and millionairematch.com. He liked the millionairematch.com site because they had an identity verification feature. In his profile, Charles wrote that he lived in a Florida high-rise and made over $500,000 per year. His apartment in the high-rise had a pool and hot tub, and he had several expensive cars. Well, sign me up.
Yeah. So a woman calling herself Sharon Helmick. Does that sound familiar?
A little bit.
Yeah, that's Alan's wife that had been dead for years. So this Sharon contacted Charles online, and he was interested in her. Her first message to him was, "Saw your profile and loved it. I can dance any dance, and I'm pretty good at it, too. I just haven't learned the West Coast swing. Your profile requirements described me completely."
That's a good bit of serendipity.
So she sent along a photo of herself and described herself as a pretty lady. Charles sent her more information about himself, and this woman, calling herself Sharon, said that she liked the finer things in life and that she could participate in them with elegance and finesse. She also said she was very sensual and sexual, and that there were many things that they could explore together. So after several emails, Charles and Sharon talked on the phone. Sharon showed up in Orlando on the very same day that Charles had just suggested that they meet up sometime. So she's a little eager. They went to a TGI Fridays for dinner and ended up staying there having drinks until 2 a.m. And during that time, Sharon told him that her late husband had been dead for about 6 to 12 months. And she explained it might have seemed too soon to be dating, but he'd been really sick for a long time before he died. Still, Charles did think it was odd that she didn't seem to know how long ago he'd died. She'd given this general estimate, right, of 6 to 12 months. Seems like the kind of thing you'd remember.
You would. Maybe it was a slow death.
Well, I'm thinking they had a few drinks and she got a little loose-lipped.
Yeah.
Because she didn't do a very good job. But, I think he just kind of wanted to hook up with somebody.
Yeah, but he's supposed to be this wealthy guy. Why would you go to TGI Fridays if you're trying to impress a woman?
Well, maybe he wasn't trying to impress her. I don't know.
That's true. Maybe he wanted to see where things were going before he started bringing out the big guns.
Well, sure. And I have to tell you, not to be mean, but he wasn't attractive. I saw him in some photos, and so he probably didn't have a lot of dates. And it seems like, this one was just over the money, obviously.
Uh-huh. She didn't show any emotion about her loss, as Charles would recall. At the restaurant, she seemed very upbeat. She had even brought along her dance shoes in case they wanted to go dancing. So they have dinner, drinks, it's 2 a.m. They go back to Charles's apartment, and they have sex. There's no time like the present.
No, that happens.
Sharon, a.k.a. Miriam, stayed for the weekend. On Monday, Charles had to work, but Miriam didn't seem to be in any hurry to leave. She wanted to move in with him right away. Now, this was a red flag for Charles. Well, God, I hope so. He was suspicious. He lied to her and said he was going out of town to see his grandchildren in Georgia, and he never saw her again.
Good choice. Well, investigators had already decided that the robbery at the Helmick house was staged. The photos taken by the sheriff's office of the interior of the Helmick's house showed that the drawers were open, but the contents really weren't rummaged through, other than a jewelry box in the bedroom. There was also a handgun and 3 long guns that weren't taken. A laptop had been left untouched too. So that's extremely suspicious because those are things that are easy to sell and get money out of.
Oh, yeah.
By the end of November 2008, investigators had a very large amount of material that made Miriam their primary suspect in the murder of her husband. So on December 1st, 2008, a detective wrote up a probable cause warrant for the arrest of Miriam. This warrant was 83 pages long.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it described incident after incident pointing to her guilt. So the summary read, based on the preceding information, there's probable cause to believe that on June 10, 2008, in the county of Mesa and state of Colorado, Miriam Helmick, a.k.a. Miriam Morgan Giles, committed the crime of murder in the first degree. Also based on the proceeding, there's probable cause to believe that on April 30th, 2008, in the county of Delta, Miriam Helmick committed the crime of criminal attempt to commit murder in the first degree. So although these two crimes were committed in two different counties, they were believed to have all come from the same criminal intent. Miriam had been trying to kill Alan all that spring, likely to cover up that she was stealing from him. She may have poisoned him too, although that wasn't part of the charges because they had no evidence of that.
No, they're just going with the attempt to bomb the car and the murder.
Yes, and then all the fraud. So Miriam was arrested in Florida, and her first court appearance ended with the bail being set at $2 million. So of course she couldn't afford that, so she stayed in jail to await extradition to Colorado. But instead of fighting extradition, Miriam told the judge she looked forward to going back to clear her name. She may have felt invincible because even after that alleged arson of her parents' house and embezzling money from several people, Miriam had never actually gone to trial, so she'd been getting away with stuff for years and years.
So by December 12, 2008, Miriam was back at Mesa County, Colorado. In court, in a red jail jumpsuit, Miriam asked for a court-appointed defense lawyer. Her bail was again set at $2 million, so Miriam stayed put in the jail while she was awaiting trial.
But of course, even after she was arrested, the investigations continued.
Well, sure.
Investigators learned that Miriam had been using ID with the name of Sharon Helmick, Alan's first wife. So they searched the name at pawn shops in the Jacksonville area, and they learned that a person claiming to be Sharon Helmick had pawned a necklace on November 29, 2008. Now, since Sharon had been dead for several years, they knew this had to be Miriam using her name, because she'd done it before. So she'd actually pawned a necklace and received $35. So now you know she wasn't hoarding that money away. Looking more closely at the driver's license, detectives saw the numbers weren't consistent with the Florida driver's license. So it was a fake. Now Miriam had been working at A&B Marketing after leaving Colorado, but she was calling herself Sharon Helmick there. And they had copies of a birth certificate and a Colorado driver's license. There was also a W-4 form with the signature of Sharon Helmick. So why in the hell, if you're going to take another identity, would you take one so closely associated with you, the man you murdered's dead wife?
Yeah, I thought she'd do something different.
Well, she got away with this for years and years, but she wasn't very smart at it. If anyone had just taken a minute to look at it and...
Yeah, you're right.
She wasn't good at it.
Yeah. So when the police looked into Miriam's emails and phone calls, they found the number for Charles Kirkpatrick, the man she had met on the millionairematch.com. They contacted him and learned that she had given him the name Sharon and that she had been eager to move in with him. In Grand Junction, Colorado, Miriam waived her right to a preliminary hearing within the next 30 days, and the local newspapers learned what the arrest warrant contained. One piece of information was that even though Alan Helmick's body was lying on the kitchen floor, next to a .25 caliber shell casing and a wallet, the house was not disturbed. There were just a few drawers opened and an overturned wastebasket, but as you've noted, none of the drawers were pulled out all the way and rummaged through. Police were able also to see inconsistencies in Miriam's statements. She told investigators that Alan had been too drunk after coming home from the Elks Lodge in Delta to speak on the phone with his daughter, Portia, the night before his murder. But bartenders at the Elks Lodge stated that Alan hadn't been there in 4 or 5 months, and the toxicology report at autopsy proved that there was no alcohol in the system.
Newspapers reported about Miriam's forging Alan's checks and keeping bank representatives from contacting him. So there was a lot of circumstantial evidence that Miriam had murdered Alan to cover up that she had been forging his checks and draining his bank accounts. But there was no physical evidence that she had murdered him. They had no confession, no gunshot residue on her, and they hadn't recovered the murder weapon. but they felt they had enough to get a conviction anyway. They just needed to get the best experts to explain this evidence to a jury. And one of the most specialized experts the prosecution hired was Lieutenant Tracy Harpster from Ohio. Harpster specialized in 911 homicide calls. He'd even taught courses to law enforcement agencies all over the country about people calling 911 and reporting robberies and suicides when the person calling had actually committed homicide. And that was what the prosecution was alleging with Miriam. Harpster had even been published on this subject and had books out about it. Now, during the trial, prosecutors brought up the forged checks in the car fire that Miriam was suspected of starting. Several attorneys at the DA's office had just recently watched the movie No Country for Old Men, and in that movie, the bad guy blew up a car, the very way that Alan's car was attempted to be blown up. So they had to wonder if Miriam had watched that movie and gotten the idea there. Then after doing a little research, they learned that someone at the Helmick house had just rented the movie weeks before the murder.
Someone? Well, there's only 2 people there.
Right.
For her November 2009 murder trial, Miriam pleaded not guilty. The prosecution had to prove their case by presenting all the circumstantial evidence. Her 911 call didn't add up, and there are several things that pointed to her killing Alan Helmick. They also believed that Miriam was behind the death of her first husband and even possibly her daughter.
Well, the prosecution was able to show financial records demonstrating how Alan's finances had steadily dwindled after he married Miriam. The car fire was allowed into evidence as a previous murder attempt. Charles Kirkpatrick even testified about his experience with Miriam and her lies about Alan's death. Then in recorded phone calls from jail to her brother, Miriam spoke confidently about how she would be acquitted, and then she would write a book to pay off her debts and just move on with her life. She also said she'd give an interview to the highest bidder. She's just lovely. Now, once the jury was out, Miriam seemed confident that she would be going home for Christmas. But the jury found her guilty of murder in the first degree, attempted murder in the car fire, and forgery after just 5 hours of deliberations. And she was sentenced to 108 years in prison. Now, some of the jurors spoke to the media, and they said that within 10 minutes of starting their deliberations, they all agreed that Miriam was guilty of false reporting with that greeting card under the doormat. And when asked why they thought Miriam was guilty, one juror said that Miriam was a psychopathic liar. The jurors agreed that Miriam had actually hurt her case by testifying in her own defense. Miriam's demeanor on the stand was seen as misleading and deceptive. Jurors also agreed that FBI agent Robert Morton had been very convincing when he testified that Miriam had staged the crime scene. The jurors had actually spent more time deliberating about the forged checks than about whether Miriam had committed murder. They felt very confident about that.
And Alan's daughter Portia told a reporter, "We are happy that she can't hurt anyone else, and this helps us to start healing. We have spent so much time and energy on Miriam. This is the end. We will spend no more."
The police tried to get charges against Miriam for the deaths of her first husband and her daughter, but they didn't have the evidence after so much time had passed. But a former neighbor of Miriam's from before Jack Giles died told reporters that Miriam did not seem to grieve after his death, and she quickly spent the life insurance money after her daughter died of a drug overdose. So she really didn't seem that broken up by either of those deaths.
Doesn't appear.
No.
According to prison records, Miriam is currently incarcerated at Denver Women's Correctional Facility in Colorado.
So quite a woman. I mean, many have speculated that Miriam is a sociopath because of her lack of emotion, and she just had this willingness to steal from and hurt anyone and then just leave. So she didn't seem to really have love or any kind of attachment to other people. Now, she never did get that book published. And this is really just a case where the killer had a long history of dishonesty and just a total disregard for human life. I mean, after all, she was willing to kill her own father in a house fire over some money. And if she's responsible for the death of her own daughter, how can you be more heartless than that?
It's a pretty low bar, isn't it?
Yeah. She's never shown any signs of remorse, not even for the forgeries. So, good riddance to Miriam.
That's right.
Yeah. TCB's music was produced by Mike McClellan. You can find out more about his work at his website, podcastps.com. If you have comments, a case suggestion, or a beer recommendation, please send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com, or even better, record a voicemail and send it to us. I'll put a direct link in our show notes like I always do, and you can click on that and record your voicemail for a future show. If you're interested in supporting our show and getting our episodes without ads, you can go ahead and get a special members-only episode each and every month by going to tiegrabber.com and subscribing. Subscribing is inexpensive, much appreciated, and there are over 150 shows in our TCB Premium feed for you to listen to and binge. And you also have the option of subscribing through Patreon by going to patreon.com/tiegrabber. Either way, you're going to get your own personal subscription link that you can paste into your podcast app so you can listen there or on our website without any commercials or promotions. Look into it.
It's time for listener feedback.
So I bet we have some great feedback to share on the show today. Take it away, Dickie.
We've got some good stuff. Ken has a voicemail with a case suggestion.
Hey, Dick and Jane. Long-time listener. I've been a premium member of Tie Grabber now for about 6 to 7 months. I enjoy your podcast immensely. I enjoy the repartee between the two of you. You really have a way of dissecting a lot of these horrendous crimes and breaking them down in exactly what happened or didn't happen in many of these cases. The first premium episode I watched was the Burger Chef murders. Thank you for covering that. I had several cousins that worked at convenience stores in the 70s. Unfortunately, 2 of them were robbed at different points, and we never got the feeling that those crimes were ever taken that seriously. I do have a beer suggestion and a case suggestion. I'm from Boston, and for the beer suggestion, I definitely recommend Harpoon Brewery, which is located in our beautiful Seaport district, and they have a really great IPA. They also do a number of seasonal brews throughout the year. The case suggestion involves Howard Unruh, who is often considered by many to be the first modern mass shooter in the United States. And I don't know if I agree with that, but Mr. Unruh did go on a mass shooting on September 6th of 1949 in his neighborhood of Camden, New Jersey. The end result was 13 people were killed. People may hear the word Camden, New Jersey and think, well, it happens there all the time, but not back in 1949. That was an era when Camden was an economic powerhouse, to say the least, and it was a very prosperous city with incredible industrial production. But the gentleman in question, like a lot of younger men at the time, served in World War II, and in particular was in the European theater in 1944 and 1945. They often saw just the absolute worst of the atrocities of that war, and many came back needing emotional support that they just didn't get then. What we call post-traumatic stress disorder, they refer to back then as shell shock. Even the movies didn't give it justice, with the single exception of probably one of the best movies ever made, The Best Years of Our Lives, that came out right after the war, so there was no time to sugarcoat things. But it's definitely a case I think the two of you would enjoy going back and doing the research on. And it's a case where his family said he came back from the war changed and not for the better. So I definitely would recommend that as a future case. Keep up doing the good. Please keep doing the good work. And we really enjoy it and hope all is well.
Thanks a lot, Ken.
Yeah, that first couple things with this one. That case, I was born in New Jersey. And so I was like a year and a half old when this crime was committed, these crimes.
Yeah.
So obviously I don't remember that, but I remember some details as I got older, because it wasn't far from our home in New Jersey.
So it was something people talked about when you were a child?
Yeah, so I remember that. And then Ken also mentioned one of his favorite breweries, Harpoon, and we lived in Maine for quite some time. We drank a lot of Harpoon.
Maybe too many, sometimes.
Not really.
Okay.
But we enjoyed our Harpoon. Yeah, the IPA is excellent, and I like their Oktoberfest. Had that.
Yeah.
Those leap into mind.
Absolutely.
It's a pretty good place.
Yeah. So the case, I think, it might be nice to do an older case, so I'm going to think about that one.
It is an older case. Now it's, a PTSD type of situation, I believe.
Well, and there's been a lot of talk lately about veterans and how our government really doesn't take care of them the way they should, so.
We'll look into that. Thank you.
Okay, so we just have a little email here, and then we'll wrap things up. We have an email from Brandy, and she has a case suggestion. She's pretty concise. She writes, please look into the murders of Tara Sue Huffman and Christopher Meyer. This is a very heartbreaking story. The murderer is Timothy Buss. You will find it heartbreaking, I'm sure. So Timothy Buss was this 14-year-old, and he murdered a 5-year-old, Tara Huffman, back in 1981. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, which he only served 12 and was paroled. In 1995, 2 years after being paroled, he murdered 9-year-old Christopher Meyer. Then, finally, he was sentenced to death. And of course, that was commuted to life in prison, which he should never be out of prison. I agree with that, absolutely. So I don't know much about this case. Have you heard of it?
No, I've never heard of it.
Okay.
It just piqued my interest that a kid, 14 years old, convicted of this crime, this murder, he's served his prison time, gets out and does it again.
Right. So either he did not get treatment or treatment didn't help.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, right.
And the other thing with this, we've talked a few times about teens, young kids guilty of murder, and how they might be rehabilitated just by the fact that they were so young when the crime occurred. And I'd submit that this is an example of that not being true.
Sadly, I think it's really a hard thing to fix. The same thing with pedophilia.
Right.
It's just something that's, even if someone's young, it might not be able to be fixed. It's just sad for everybody.
Certainly is.
Now, I do think we've had quite a few cases lately that involve children, and I need a break from that, but I will certainly look into this for down the road.
We'll check it out.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for listening and for your wonderful feedback. We appreciate it very much. And we'll see you next time at The Quiet End.
We'll save a couple chairs.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.